I'm Jack, as I mentioned, from Orbis. I'm a Customer Success Manager. Some of you may have seen or heard of me before. Be running you through today's webinar with Stephen. So I'll let Stephen introduce himself as we get going now.
Hello, everybody. Stephen Glotzober. I'm a consultant with Orbis Professional Services. So I'm actually out of the North America region. So many of you have probably worked with professional services in one form or the other. Pleasure to be here and looking forward to seeing what questions you have.
Perfect. Thanks, Stephen. So just to get onto an agenda for the webinar today, we'll be going through just an initial presentation on the topic we'll be covering, which is data management, data lifecycle management, best practices in iServer 365. So we'll be covering an initial presentation on why that matters initially, what the topic means, and then we'll go through some of the kind of standout points in that you can do in iServer 365 before we hand over to Stephen for a 20-25 minute demo of some of the things that I'll be talking about, and then we'll open up the floor to a kind of 15-minute Q&A towards the end of the session. So just to get started, so data lifecycle management, what does that mean? We're starting with why is it important? So some of the goals you see on screen now, you may have seen or discussed with us in the past. Items such as single source of truth, controlling IT costs and complexity, connecting teams to deliver business outcomes, and ultimately, in the end, everyone wants faster strategic decisions. All important topics, all things that you need data quality, that you need trustworthy data first. You're not going to be able to achieve any of these really effectively within the business if you don't have data you can trust, that you can learn from. And so that's why we're focusing on this topic, and it's why it's such a big topic for many of our users, all of you attending today. So before we get into some of how iServer 365 covers it, what is data lifecycle management? So we'll start with a little quote from IBM just on the next slide that we'll go to now. Data lifecycle management is an approach to managing data throughout its lifecycle, from data entry to data destruction. We'll be covering different topics throughout this webinar, following a customer journey of, okay, what do I do when I'm getting started and I'm getting my data into iServer 365? Moving on to, okay, I've got my data, what do I do with it now? How do I share it, make it more visible within my business? To more long-term methods for managing your data, making sure that it's accurate and remains accurate over a longer period of time. And the different phases of that life cycle that you see on screen now will reflect that. How do you interact with your data when you're getting going versus later on in that process? So some early topics that we face with customers in iServer 365 is often questions such as this: where do I get started? So when you're getting going, often people wonder, okay, what data do I need to get into iServer 365? Do I need to get everything in straight away? Do I need to make sure that it's all perfectly clean, ready, good to go? Often we would advise a happy medium between the two, trying to make sure that you're not waiting too long before you're getting really into using iServer 365, that you can get your users engaged early on with the software, but at the same time, do consider what use cases you'll be focusing on. So when choosing what data you want to first get into iServer 365, think about what data you want to get in to achieve your end goals. What data is going to be useful that you can then use iServer 365 to improve and to grow over time. So as you're getting that data in, the other early consideration here is who should have access to our data, who are we going to get in. Data is an important topic in every business, and that's exactly why we're running this session today. So it's about considering not only what you're getting in, but who needs it and who's going to use it. So as you're getting that data into iServer 365, always consider, what, for example, owners and teams you want to make sure that data is visible and accessible to. The more data you have, the more you can get out of the tool ultimately, but it's important to consider who you're giving access to that data and when it's ready to be shared as well. And remember that with great power comes great responsibility. So make sure that you're running through and keeping in mind, who's getting access to that information over time. And then moving slightly on. So okay, we've got our data in now. We've got a few limited people that have access to that data, that are working on that data. What do I do now? The one thing we push is always make sure that you are able to share that information with your wider business. What Stephen will be running through is some real kind of top tips, particularly in SharePoint. And it's important to make sure that you're sharing that data early on in SharePoint, that you're not afraid to introduce that information to the wider business. And SharePoint is a really good way of doing that through a load of our complex features like our intake forms and our solutions, but also just the really simple ability to build SharePoint pages that fit your needs with our web parts that really just allow that easy access to information. So beyond simple web part pages, we also have reports and dashboards that many of you will be familiar with. What we would also suggest is don't be afraid of using these reports and getting these reports set up early on, or maybe it's a new use case that you didn't think you really got all of the data there for. Don't be afraid of trying to get these reports running and looking at these reports early on in the process. They're your friend, they're not your enemy. They're there to help you grow. Many people may think that these reports are needed to, okay, just the end goal that I can show to my stakeholders or my boss to show them our end result of how great we are. It's about learning from your data and improving what you've got. So our portfolio core report packs, for example, the application one that you see here, all have a data completeness report. They're a really good, simple example of if you can get these reports running earlier on, you can learn from that data, you can increase that and improve and work on that data over time. So these reports are a really good way of showing you, oh, actually, we're barely using this attribute within our applications, or oh, this certain group of owners, maybe a certain team, isn't interacting with the data as much and they don't have that same level of data quality or quantity. So it's a really good way of having that visibility to grow, not just to the end goal of what we've got. And then once you've introduced that, another really good tool that we'll be sharing with you in a bit more detail is intake forms. Intake forms are a really simple way of creating information and allowing your wider user base of contributors to create information in the tool. So directly in SharePoint, you have a custom intake form solution that you can set up from your solutions hub, and you can choose exactly what attributes and what layout you want for these forms to suit your users and your needs. But it's a really good way of giving your contributors more control over the information that you create. And again, the more you're able to introduce your wider contributors to these features, the more you'll see your data grow. It's not just about a small team building this data, but trying to make it visible and accessible so that you can get help from the wider business or just other teams within your department, for example. And then once you've beyond our intake forms, you also have associated SharePoint lists. These are pretty standard SharePoint list functionality, but you can pair these with an intake form to have really easy ways of people seeing and being able to edit and view that data as well. So we'll be going through a little bit of what that looks like, but you've got a screenshot on here and we'll be able to expand on that a little bit more. And I mentioned earlier really thinking about who gets access to your information and who you share your data with. And that's really where we get an item of data governance that comes in as well. So you have the ability in iServer 365 in your configuration area to set an object type as approvable. If you set an object type as approvable, as a default, all of those objects will be given an approved status. And when one of your then users or contributors, for example, in SharePoint, uses a web part to edit that object and make a change, that approval status will be changed from approved to not approved. And you then have the ability for an owner or an admin to review that list of not approved objects, review what changes have been requested and approve those changes. And it's a really simple way of having a bit of data governance within the platform. And you can build really simple lists in SharePoint that just show this is a page with my approved, in this case, business processes. And this is a list of all of my not approved business processes, but really easy ways of breaking that down. And as you grow that data, making sure that you keep control of it at the same time. So there's some of the main topics that we'll be covering, but Stephen's going to expand on these a little bit more now. So Stephen's going to pause this and get into a demo in SharePoint of some of these features, and I'm sure plenty more. Any questions that you think of as we're going through any of this, please don't be afraid to jump in, to ask questions in the chat, and we'll get back to as many of these, as I mentioned, as we can. And over to Stephen.
All right, thank you very much, Jack. Let me just do a quick scene change here. And we'll continue on. So hello, everybody. Again, Stephen Glotzober for the folks that may have joined a little bit late, but I'm from Orbis Professional Services, so I'm sure many of you have worked with us before. What I'm going to start with is one of the most common areas that we see customers that can improve upon their iServer 365 usage, and this is SharePoint, actually. So one of the first points that Jack hit on is how do we communicate our data? You'll often hear us talk about data in 3 steps. It's getting data into the tool, it's querying the data to reflect what we're trying to achieve with the data, but then it's communicating the data and telling the story behind our data. So every piece of data that we capture, there should be an end goal with that piece of data. There should be an audience in mind, and our data in aggregate tells a story, and sometimes that story is, hey, we need more data. We don't have a complete data set. Sometimes that data drives us to decisions that we weren't thinking of making, and then sometimes the data drives us to decisions that we were contemplating, but maybe it's taking us in a different direction. So at its core, the tool helps us capture data across the enterprise. So we'll start with SharePoint, and what I'm showing here is a sample landing page tailored to application data. So I encourage everybody on the call to review how they're using SharePoint, seeing how they can use it effectively based on what we show here. Everything that I'm going to show is basic functionality that you'd learn from our generic user and administrator trainings. So nothing complex. I think you heard Jack say it as well, and we're also a fan of saying, keeping it simple is one of the best ways to drive adoption from iServer 365 users and non-users alike. So what we have here is you have a full palette of different SharePoint web parts available to you. Some are iServer 365 specific, but the majority of them are your typical SharePoint features. So customers that we see that are very successful, they use SharePoint to really brand enterprise architecture and their digital transformation initiatives, and they can use key features such as just a countdown to a big organization event. Maybe it's ticking off your FY23 budgeting process. Maybe it's ticking off a new review process. But we see users leverage SharePoint for this ability all the time, and it's very powerful because now this SharePoint page draws iServer 365 data, but the focus is on the enterprise. So that's key tip number 1, which is don't just use the iServer 365 web parts, really make it your own and really tailor SharePoint usage to the organization. What we also have here are some key things that we think help customers achieve better data quality. And the first is just being open about we're not where we want to be. So for example, right now, we're saying that our organization's at 32% completeness for attribute completeness. Our goal right now is above 50%. So we're open and honest that our data is not quite where we see ourselves in the future, but we do have a metric that we're looking to hit, and we're constantly improving upon this metric. So that's another key tip, which is be open about where you're at in the data quality journey. It is an improvement process, and it's a continual process. You'll recognize in the lower right-hand corner the application portfolio health iServer 365 web part. This is a web part of live iServer 365 data showing our current application portfolio. And if I'm a non-iServer 365 user, I can come into this page and start to see my live data. So I can already pick out, if I'm reviewing this, it looks like I've actually got a duplicate application or something that looks a little wonky to me. So maybe I can follow up with some of my key users on why that is. but I can leverage this view to look at my actual application portfolio, look at some of the attributes behind the data, and I'm bringing users into the tool via SharePoint. And SharePoint is something that most enterprises use in one form or fashion. What we also recommend, and customers that are successful, you don't just use iServer 365 and SharePoint for tool-specific functions. You use it to communicate around governance and your specific processes. So when we work with customers, one thing we'll see is that we have point-in-time exercises across an enterprise architecture team. We really want to move and shift that mindset to continual improvement, which includes transition of personnel. So when you bring somebody into the organization, there should be one place, and we recommend it be SharePoint, where that person can go and find the information around how you're managing data. So this is an example of what this organization would do and how they communicate, how they manage data. But there's an old saying, and some people disagree with it, some people agree with it, but if it's not documented, it doesn't exist. Certainly, a lot of communication happens word of mouth, whether it's in Teams meetings or kind of water cooler talk. But everybody recollects conversations differently, so recommend that you take the time to document out your processes. And here we see this organization has clearly identified their data lifecycle, from identifying the data need through capturing the data to updating or archiving the data. And included in that process is reviewing the data. So every piece of data that's inputted into iServer 365 has metadata behind it that captures when it was last modified and who it was last modified by. That should all be part of a recurring attestation process to say, we've just reviewed this piece of data, we've identified each piece of data and its owner, and we can confidently say that this data set is accurate. So very important that you understand where the level of accuracy is in your data. And then successful organizations also boil down what they're trying to achieve and what iServer 365 features are important. And so that's what the right side of this page here has. We have a full feature set that supports many different things in iServer 365. Part of the key in using the tool effectively for your outcome is just understanding what features do I need to use for this particular outcome. So if we're capturing data, I should immediately go towards, well, I can import data in aggregate and mass via Excel. I can edit data via SharePoint views. I can create data in the web app. I can use the intake forms if I have folks that aren't familiar with the tool. But this should be a fairly quick exercise. Based on what you're trying to do, you should have one place to go to say, here's the features that I need to look at. And now I can use this to say, well, I haven't done anything with Excel import in a while, so maybe I'll go check the knowledge base, or maybe I'll watch the video on Hive in how to do that. And then finally, you should have documented somewhere your existing meta model and its diagram. So meta model, you'll often hear professional services just talk about the meta model is how you capture data about your organization. That should be clear, and it should be understood from each of your architects and folks that will be creating content, where they can find that copy. So it should never be a question of what data am I capturing. There should be a place where we can go to see that. And we also have features in the tool to support visualizing the meta model and managing that governance. But it's always important to have a common set of architecture artifacts, and SharePoint's just a ready-made place for you to keep that. So we'll go back up to this home page. And from here, what we heard Jack talk about is actually our data completeness report. So maybe this organization, we have an ongoing initiative to enrich the application portfolio data. And with our out-of-the-box report packs, you get numerous pages that display information for each concept. So for our application portfolio, we can look at what applications support our capabilities, what applications are supported by XYZ vendors, etc. But one of the key things is the data completeness report. So if we launch this particular report, we'll see that we have a screenshot and window into the attribute completeness, which is what we quoted on that SharePoint page. So this is a report that will refresh daily, but we can see by attribute, we've captured about over 70% of the deployment models for our applications, which could be very helpful and if we ever are planning kind of an enterprise cloud migration initiative. But we're really lacking in assigning ownership, cost data on the maintenance, license data, etc. So this report, when you're working to enrich your data, which is a continual process, you can leverage these reports to see quantitatively and objectively how much data do you have on hand and where do you need to prioritize. And if I'm an executive or a chief architect, I can quickly see, hey, actually we're looking at license restructuring so that we can win some easy cost savings. We actually can't do that initiative right now because we just don't even know the number of licenses purchased. So we're gonna actually take our focus now and work on getting license data into the tool, because we know that just looking at our application portfolio, restructuring licenses is one lever we can pull to save cost. So really want to emphasize, many people use our out-of-the-box report packs for their visualizations. They've got some great visualizations that drive decision making. When you're talking about data lifecycle management, leverage the data completeness report and refer to it frequently as you enrich your data. And then lastly, we have our SharePoint page, and what we can do is also break out data by business unit, or it could be by owner. Many different areas that we could choose to separate our data by. This organization, we see that they've broken it out by some of their key business units. And now if I'm a novice user, I can go into one of these business units, say information technology, and look a little bit deeper into what information technology is doing with their applications. And so we talked about the approval status of applications. And one of the objectives that we've set for this year is making the approval of our applications a priority. And so we can look at the different applications that are assigned to information technology. And if we select one, we can look at the feedback on the application and post feedback. We can also edit the application details as well. So we just saw the view graph on attribute completeness. But this is a way that I can bring in application portfolio owners or business unit owners that may know bits and pieces of my application data, and I can have them edit the object right here and assign different pieces of data right within SharePoint. So there's no need for Teams calls or sending the information by Teams chats or email, spreadsheets, whatever you may be currently using. You can just send a link to the information technology portfolio, and we can just edit this data and say, actually, this is owned by Steven, so I'm going to assign that owner so that we can leverage that. Each piece of data should have an owner. We should have one person in the organization that if we're looking at logic apps to say, go to Steven, he's in charge and he is responsible for understanding this application and the data behind it. So that'll help you enrich the data set. So now we've got a taste for SharePoint. And one thing, if I'm looking at this, I actually really like what information technology portfolio has done. And so if I'm an iServer 365 user and I've been tasked with improving the usage across maybe it's risk management, I'm already starting to think of, well, how can I use the tool and this concept of reuse to save time on my end? So we'll talk through how you can do that within iServer 365. I always recommend that your first inkling whenever you're getting a task or you have an idea is to look to reuse wherever possible. So these SharePoint pages, they come together very quickly when you copy the page, and in iServer 365 you can use public views as well to reuse based on a particular area. So if I'm looking at a SharePoint page and I'm inspired, I can go back to my iServer 365 platform here, and I can go to the public views that have been created. And I can say, well, I did like what the IT portfolio has done. I can select the view, and this is not creating a view from scratch or getting a handle on the filters. This is just changing out different attributes that you're filtering by. So I'm going to say, well, I've got the list of not approved applications for IT, but now let's maybe see what we have for risk management, or we could do sales, whatever business units or attribute that you're looking to capture here. And then I can run the filter, and I have a new list of applications for risk management. And instead of creating new, I can just save this view as a new view. And then I can take the view ID. I can go to the iServer 365 view ID in the details tab. I can copy this. And then back in SharePoint, I can actually just create a new copy of this page. And I can call this FY22 applications for risk management. And now I just need to switch out the web part view ID. So it's very simple. It's very quick to reuse the content across your organization. And that's one way that you can really gain efficiency with this tool and really have different cuts of data come together very quickly. And that's something that we see customers, struggle is not the right word, but we see customers not looking to optimize enough. So we're all great with a certain feature set in iServer 365, a certain feature set that we use on a day-to-day. But when we get asked about enterprise perspectives, we should immediately start to think of how can I leverage that feature set to really provide the enterprise perspective. I know how to do views for information technology, but now somebody's asking me about, well, I like what you did there. How can I apply it to risk management? And those types of steps and quick tips to create a page such as we just did here are very fast to do, and it will also bring in people into the tool, because now you are getting them the data that they want, and they're starting to see, wow, that was actually very quick. Now the next time I need information on risk management, I can go to SharePoint. I don't need to reach out to this person on Teams or via email. So very helpful to leverage the reuse capability within the tool is another tip there. Lastly, what we typically see here as well in the tool is when we think about the life cycle of data, it would be cleanest if we were always there at the start. A lot of times we're not there at the start of the life cycle. So we may come into a tool just like this, and we're hopping into iServer 365, and we're looking at our application data. And this may have been imported at one time or the other by the Excel import tool. We just don't know. We're seeing the data not when it started. So we have this window into the completeness via the data completeness reports and the SharePoint pages. But now we're starting to assess, hey, is this data actually the set that we need to go forward with? How accurate is it? Those types of questions. One thing that we were able to do, we noticed on the SharePoint page that we had an application that looked like a duplicate. Looks like maybe this application got inputted twice. So we do have features to support cleaning up your existing data as well. So it's not just always asking people to input information into the tool. It's, well, I can look at these two applications and say, well, it looks like this description, we already know this is not correct. But here's that, it looks like a description that's accurate. And we can merge these objects together. So this is the object merge feature. And we'll get a wizard here, and we can say, we'll select one item to update. And now we can say which attributes do we want to keep from what from each object. So we can say, we'll keep these attributes here, but we know that the description is not accurate. So it looks like we've got two instances of essentially the same application. One is more correct, but the description looks off, and one has no data, but the description is accurate. So now we can clean up our existing data set by merging these objects together. And what we'll be left with is one application for Team Suite. And so after we've taken that action, we can view Team Suite. And one thing that we talked about, we can see the description is now accurate here. One thing we talked about though is being able to approve these objects. So once we have data into the tool, we can institute governance to say, hey, is this application approved? Should we keep it in the approved list? We can always start those approval workflows. So this request will submit an email to a list of identified approvers, and we can say submit. So if I'm an approver for this application, I'll get an email saying to go review this application and approve it. When I click the link into that email, I will see on the object that I can either reject or approve those changes. So now I could click approve. And I can add a comment here, reviewed and approved, however you prefer to do this, but gives you some history behind any approvals, as well as some governance around managing your current state of data. So this is another key feature I would highly recommend you look into if you're not currently leveraging, and see where it fits. So again, everything that we're showing here are the basic features, but we see the majority of customers, I'd say anywhere between 60 and 75% of the customers that we speak with when we show them this content, most customers do have a place that they could institute these features fairly quickly and get you better results here. So lastly, we'll talk through our intake forms. SharePoint, another great feature of this platform is via SharePoint, we already know we can bring people into the data that don't need to know iServer 365. One way that we can do that are intake forms. I've got a couple set up here, and maybe I can submit a technology intake form. So we've been focusing on application data so far. And what we tend to see from customers is our application architects, they don't know the infrastructure underlying it. Which is very common, and just or for example, the application architects don't know the security policies that govern their network. All very common. This is why we do enterprise architecture, to collaborate across these disciplines, get one cohesive set of data. So the intake forms are ways that we can send to our users to capture data about the organization. In this case, it's a very simple one. I'm just asking for a technology name and the description. But I can create a technology from this intake form via our Solutions Hub. So this is a pre-made intake form, but a lot of the times we'll get feedback, and we have many customers using these, where we work with you to implement an intake form, and then we get feedback that, hey, the users love it, we want to do more intake forms, etc. So I thought it would just be good to walk you through how to create those intake forms via your Solutions Hub. So if we like the look and feel of the technology intake form, we can go to our Solutions Hub, and I've already queried intake just to get the solutions that are relevant to this set. And we've got really two that we want to focus on. The first is a solution that we run to set up an intake form to create those new items. So that's what we were just looking at. And then the second part of this is, once that intake form is submitted, what happens? And we want to also run the second solution in order to get the data into iServer 365. One thing, if you're not as familiar with Solutions Hub, if you see this green power outlet, it means that it has been previously activated. This solution is nice in that you can reactivate it for a new intake form. So we'll click open this particular solution. We can get a description of what the solution provides, and we can see that it provisions an intake form, enabling the creation of items in iServer 365. So this is what we want to do. We can go to our publisher notes for a very detailed walkthrough of what this solution entails, what it requires, and how the solution is structured. So we can look at the different fields that we'll have to fill out in terms of the data from both a SharePoint perspective as well as an iServer 365 attribute. And then we'll see that we are provisioning a list in iServer 365, and then we'll be able to create items. So we can look at our publisher notes, and this is globally across the different solutions that we have in iServer 365. The publisher notes are always a great place to look at what the solution entails, what are the technical requirements for it, etc. Now we'll go to edit solution, and I'm going to edit the solution settings. And we'll see here that we're asked for a couple pieces of information when we set up this form. First is, what object are we creating? So in our previous example, we said we're going to create a technology. Maybe what we want to say is, well, the technology was great. We love that. But can we use this to help create a capability? Maybe we've got a capability initiative that we're working on, and we'll create it in the current state. And then we'll go to the mappings field, and we'll say we can use our previous form here. So we can say capability intake form, change this to capability. And again, I'm reusing, I'm not recreating anything or recreating the wheel. I'm just saying, hey, let's reuse what we can. So now I can say we can give the field a name. So we'll say it's the description. And now we can add different attributes that we want to capture. So I've already previously added that I want to capture the description whenever I create a technology. I'll do the same for a capability. I also have the flexibility to add different relationships. So I can not only create one object in iServer 365, I can create an object as well as relationships to existing items. And if I choose this option, I'm going to get a list of essentially fields where I'm saying, well, what do I want to relate this to? And what relationship should that what relationship should be created? So this is another feature that you can do when you're setting up your intake forms. So I'll go back to attribute here, and you can change the order of how these appear in the form, and then you can remove something if you don't need it anymore. But that's really at its core all that this solution requires. So if you have an understanding of how you want to leverage the intake form solution, what data you want to create, what attributes do you want it to be related to other items, you can use this particular solution, and then you can click finish. You'll get a message saying activating solution. Once that's complete, you can click run. So the whole process end to end takes maybe 10, 15 minutes. After you've clicked run, it will provision the form, and you'll end up with a technology intake form, or in this case, it'd be a capability intake form. So I won't go and run and create that form right now, just so that we don't have to wait for the list to provision. But process is anywhere from 5 to 10, 15 minutes at most for these solutions. So it's very straightforward to do if you follow the publisher notes, and it's something that you don't need to work with Orbis for in order to do. So I hope that you start to use the intake forms where it makes sense within your organization. It's just another way to bring people into iServer 365 data. Lastly, the only other thing I want to show here is not particular or unique to data lifecycle management, but one thing we noticed from customers that we work with in professional services is this is a SaaS tool. This is a tool that's updated frequently. New features are being released that are great help in all areas or work streams that you're probably looking to achieve. And we have areas that you can view these release notes at on your landing page. So you can view the release notes here in the top right. You can also view them if you go to our knowledge base to see what releases or what features have been released, and then you can look to see how you can leverage them. So it's a very useful way to stay current on what's been released. And as an iServer administrator or an iServer power user, part of what you should always be looking for is when a new feature is released, it's just like getting a gift during the holidays. You should already be looking at, well, this is going to be a lot of fun. How am I going to use it? How am I going to communicate that this feature is existing? How are we going to work it into our existing practice? Again, SharePoint, you can use SharePoint for all of those. So really want to stress that features are being released that help with data lifecycle management all the time. I showed object merge, and we've released several features around object merge this current year. And when we speak to customers, a lot have not heard of object merge before. So always encourage you to stay current on what's been released and use it to work into what you're looking to achieve. But with that, I want to make sure we leave some time for questions here. So I'm going to wrap up here, and we can see what questions have been asked and kind of go from there. So I'll pass it back to you, Jack.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Stephen, for that. Thanks everyone for watching.